Whatever love means. 4 words, said on camera, in front of the world, on the day that was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Diana was standing beside Charles on the steps of Buckingham Palace on February 24, 1981. The engagement had just been announced. The sapphire ring was on her finger. The photographers were arranged in front of them. The whole machinery of the fairy tale was already in motion. The press releases, the commemorative merchandise, the plans for the wedding that would eventually be watched by 750 million people. A reporter asked the obvious question. The question that every person in the world, watching 2 people who had just announced they were going to be married, wanted to know the answer to. Are you in love? Diana answered first, in her own voice, on the Settlin tapes recorded a decade later. She described her reaction to the question. She said she thought it was a thick question. Of course they were in love. What else would they be? She said yes, immediately, with everything she had. And then Charles turned and said 4 words that she would spend the rest of her life trying to put somewhere. Whatever love means. She described what happened inside her when she heard it. She used a specific word. Not surprised, not confused, not hurt, though she was all of those things. Traumatized. That threw me completely, I thought. What a strange answer. God, absolutely traumatized me. She was 19 years old. She had just said yes in front of the world. The ring was on her finger. And the man she was going to marry had been asked if he was in love with her and had answered by questioning whether love was a concept with a stable meaning. The world watching at home found it charming, philosophical perhaps. A little eccentric, the way Charles was sometimes eccentric. The cameras moved on. The engagement continued. The tea towels were printed. Diana carried the sentence for the rest of her life. It was the first stone in a wall that would be built, one detail at a time, for the next 15 years. And when she finally put it on the record, in a private room in Kensington Palace, alone with a video camera and her voice coach and the freedom to say what she actually remembered, the sentence came out with the same weight it had landed with on the steps of the palace. Still there. Still exactly that shape. Whatever love means. This is that story. Not just the 4 words. The full context, what came before them, what came with them, what they revealed about the marriage that followed. Everything Diana said about the engagement, the courtship, the proposal, the night before the wedding, and the sentence that never stopped haunting her. Every detail documented, every word sourced. Everything in this script comes from Diana's own voice on the Settlin tapes, recorded privately in 1992 and 1993, with her voice coach Peter Settlin, broadcast in America in 2004 and in Britain in 2017. From the Morton tapes recorded in 1991 and 1992, released publicly after her death. From Penny Thornton, Diana's astrologer and confidante, who appeared in the 2020 ITV documentary The Diana Interview, Revenge of a Princess. From biographers Sally Bedell Smith, Tina Brown, Ingrid Seward and Robert Jobson, whose combined decades of research form the most complete picture available of this marriage from the outside. Where accounts differ, I'll tell you. Nothing here is guesswork. Before we go any further, if this channel has ever given you a version of Diana that felt true, take 1 second and subscribe. This one begins at the beginning, which is where the whole story lives. Here is the detail that sits underneath everything else. The context that makes the 4 words on the steps make sense from both sides. Before the engagement was announced, Diana and Charles had met 13 times. 13. Over the course of a courtship that began in the summer of 1980, spanned roughly 6 months, and culminated in a proposal in the nursery at Windsor Castle, the 2 people who were about to become the most watched couple on earth had spent 13 occasions in each other's company. Diana confirmed this herself on the Settlin tapes. She said it without apparent bitterness, just as a fact that she had been living with long enough that it had stopped astonishing her, even though it should never have stopped astonishing anyone. 13 times. Not 13 dates, in the ordinary sense of the word. 13 occasions, some formal, some arranged by the institution, some brief enough that they barely constituted what most people would call getting to know someone. Diana herself said she didn't know Charles. She said it plainly. She was brought up, she told Settlin, in the sense that when you got engaged to someone, you loved them. That was the assumption she had brought to the relationship. That she was marrying someone she knew and loved and who knew and loved her. The record suggests neither party had yet reached that point when the announcement was made on February 24th. Charles, according to royal correspondent Robert Jobson's account in Charles at 70, told friends years later that he had desperately wanted to get out of the wedding during the engagement, having discovered how awful the prospects were. He had had no chance to get to know Diana beforehand. He tried to talk to her about his work, and she would stare back blankly. He realized, once the engagement was announced and the media scrutiny intensified, that there was no way out. The machinery of the fairy tale had closed around both of them. In truth, Jobson wrote, neither of them was actually in love with the other. Charles had been in love with someone for most of his adult life. That someone had gotten married to someone else in 1973, while Charles was away in the Navy and had produced 2 children and had remained. Regardless of all of that, the person Charles called when he wanted to say whatever happens, I will always love you. Diana did not fully know the scale of this in February 1981. She knew something. She had instincts that she described, on the Setelen tapes, as telling her something was not right. But she was 19 years old, and she was in love with the idea of him, if not yet with the substance, and the institution that surrounded the marriage had decided the marriage should happen, and her face was going to be on the tea towels, and she said yes. And then Charles turned to the camera and said 4 words that told her, if she had known quite how to read them, exactly where she stood. To understand what the 4 words meant, you have to understand what came before them. The 6 months between meeting and engagement that Diana described on her tapes with the specific wry candor of a woman who had had years to understand what she was describing. Charles, she said on the Setelen tapes, was all over her like a bad rash at the second meeting. That was how it began, eagerly, enthusiastically, with the particular intensity of a man who had been told by his family and his institution that it was time to find a suitable bride, and had found one. Diana was young, unentangled, from the right background. The newspapers had already written stories suggesting she might be the one. The momentum of the thing was already building before either of them had decided anything consciously. But the consistency of Charles's attention was not what Diana had expected or hoped for. She described it on the tapes with a weariness that sounds like a woman remembering the exact shape of the confusion. He'd ring me up every day for a week, and then he wouldn't speak to me for 3 weeks. Very odd. I thought, fine, he knows where I am if he wants me. Hot and cold, the phrase she would later use to describe the entire marriage. Hot and cold, you never knew what mood it was going to be, applied from the beginning, from the second meeting onward. The intermittent attention that kept her hoping and then withdrew. The thrill of the phone ringing, she said, was immense and intense when he did call, which means the silence between the calls was its own kind of suffering. She had never been told that Charles was in love with Camilla Parker Bowles. She had not been given the information that the marriage she was entering had been preceded, in Charles's emotional life, by a relationship that had never really ended. She was 19 years old, and she was interpreting the hot and cold through the only framework available to a 19-year-old, that this was simply how he was. Odd. Inconsistent. Worth waiting for. She waited. February 6, 1981. Windsor Castle. Charles leads Diana to the nursery. He tells her he has missed her so much. He then asks her to marry him. She later described her reaction on the Morton tapes. She said she laughed. Not joyfully, nervously. The kind of laugh that happens when the situation is so large and so unexpected, in the specific way it arrives, that the body doesn't know what else to do. She said yes. She thought it was a joke at first. She said yes. He went to ring the Queen. And in the space between the yes and the phone call to his mother, Diana said something else on the tapes about that moment in the nursery. She said she thought the whole thing was so grown up. She was Diana, a kindergarten teacher. And here she was in a nursery at Windsor Castle, having just said yes to the Prince of Wales. I tell you, the whole thing was ridiculous. Not romantic. Ridiculous. That was the word she chose years later to describe the moment that the world had imagined as a fairy tale proposal. Ridiculous. Too large, too fast, too strange. A 19-year-old in a nursery saying yes to a question she had not known was coming, to a man she had met 13 times, while the institution outside the castle walls was already loading the printing presses with her image. She loved him, she said, in the way that she understood love at 19. She had hope. She had it in abundance. She was bringing everything she had to something she had not fully seen yet. February 24, 1981. Buckingham Palace. The world gathered outside the gates. The announcement was made. The photographers arranged themselves. The ring was displayed, the sapphire that had been chosen from a catalogue, from a selection of rings offered to Diana and Charles together. Diana chose it herself. Charles was not particularly engaged in the process, by various accounts. She pointed to the one she wanted. And then Charles had turned and given the answer that was not yes. That was not, in any version of any language, a simple affirmation. That was a philosophical qualification. A condition applied to the sentence before he would say it. A man saying, I will answer this question, but first I need to establish that the key term is not self-evident, whatever love means, she thought. What a strange answer. She thought, God, she said. It traumatized me. Traumatized, the word a person uses when something has not just upset them but entered them, when it has installed itself somewhere and changed the way the world looks from the inside. She was 19 years old, on the steps of Buckingham Palace, carrying a sapphire ring she had chosen herself, and she had just been told, on camera, in front of everyone, that the man who had asked her to marry him was not prepared to say he was in love with her without first appending a philosophical disclaimer. She smiled. For the cameras. She had been doing that for weeks. She would do it for 15 more years. The biographer, Sally Bedell Smith, in her authorized account of Charles's life, offered a defense of the 4 words that has become the standard one. She said it was a totally inappropriate thing for him to say, but understandable given the way his mind worked. She said Charles had given a series of interviews in the 1970s about what he wanted in a wife, about what being in love meant. She said he was thinking out loud, overthinking, as he sometimes did. The philosophical observation was not intended as coldness. The defense is not wrong exactly. Charles had a tendency toward this kind of reflective qualification. He was a man who had been educated to interrogate assumptions, who read and thought about meaning with an earnestness that could produce, in the wrong context, sentences that landed like stones. But here is the problem with that defense. It doesn't change what Diana heard. It doesn't change what the sentence meant to a 19-year-old woman standing beside a man she had said yes to, on camera, in public. The intention behind the 4 words belongs to Charles. The experience of receiving them belongs entirely to Diana. And Diana's experience, documented in her own voice, on tape, is the one this channel takes seriously. She heard a man who was not prepared to say he loved her. She was right, he wasn't. It didn't end with the 4 words on the steps. It got worse. Penny Thornton was Diana's astrologer and friend. She appeared in the 2020 ITV documentary The Diana Interview, Revenge of a Princess, and she said something that stops you cold. The night before the wedding, July 28, 1981, the last night Diana would spend as Lady Diana Spencer, Charles told her he didn't love her. Thornton's account. One of the most shocking things that Diana told me was that the night before the wedding, Charles told her that he didn't love her. I think Charles didn't want to go into the wedding on a false premise. He wanted to square it with her, and it was devastating for Diana. She didn't want to go through with the wedding at that point. She thought about not attending. The night before the wedding, after the dress had been fitted, after the guest list had been finalized, after the rehearsal at St. Paul's, after the commemorative merchandise had been manufactured and distributed, after the 750 million people had arranged their lives around watching this event the following morning. The night before all of that, the man she was marrying told her he didn't love her, and she thought about not going. She didn't not go. Biographer Ingrid Seward described what happened when Diana went to her father. He pointed out it would be an act of gross discourtesy to break off her engagement to the future king so close to the wedding. Diana couldn't deny she still wanted to be the Princess of Wales. And at 19, she was young enough to still believe in happy endings, despite what her instincts were telling her on that terrible night. So she went, in the ivory silk dress with the 25-foot train. With the Spencer tiara and the perfume stain on her wrist, she was trying to cover with her hand. With the knowledge of the night before sitting in her chest, she walked down the aisle and scanned the pews and found Camilla's pale grey pillbox hat, and said, inside herself, I hope that's all over now. She had hope, still, after everything. She brought it all the way to the altar. There is another detail from this period that sits alongside the whatever love means in a way that builds the full picture. After Charles was told that he was going to marry Diana, after the pressure from Philip, after the family's calculation, after the decision was made at the institutional level, he reportedly went to Diana's mother, Frances Shand Kidd, and told her something. He said he could not guarantee that he would be faithful. A man going to the mother of the woman he was about to marry and telling her, in advance, that fidelity was not something he was prepared to promise. The detail that explains why it was the sentence she came back to, why it was the one that traumatized rather than any of the others. On the Satellan tapes, Diana said it directly. She said, I was brought up in the sense that when you got engaged to someone, you loved them. That was her framework. simple, uncomplicated. The framework of a young woman raised in a world where engagement meant love and love meant you said so, where the question, "Are you in love?" had one answer, and the answer was yes, and the only question was how loud and how clearly and with how much feeling. She had said yes.
Immediately, without reservation, with everything she had. And Charles had said whatever love means. The gap between those two answers is the gap between the two people who stood on those steps that day. Diana brought the framework of love as a clear, declarable, unambiguous fact. Charles brought the framework of love as a philosophical concept requiring definitional work before a position could be taken. Diana was not wrong. Charles was not stupid, but they were not in the same conversation. They were not answering the same question.
And they would spend the next 15 years failing, repeatedly, and at great cost, to find the conversation they were actually both in, 16 years after the engagement announcement. The summer of 1997, Diana was 35. The divorce had been finalized the year before. She was living her own life in ways the institution had never wanted her to. She had been to Angola. She was about to go to Bosnia. She was raising 2 sons and doing the work that she had, since the conversation in Rome with Mother Teresa, understood to be the thing her suffering had been preparing her for. She had not forgotten the 4 words. There is no evidence she ever did. The Satellan tapes recorded in 1992, when she was 31, are the place where the sentence appears on the record, and she delivered it with the specific weight of something that had been carried for a long time, not freshly grieved, settled, absorbed into the architecture of how she understood the marriage and herself inside it. She said, "It traumatized me," not past tense as in, "It used to traumatize me, and now it doesn't." Present tense delivered retrospectively, as in, "This is still the true description of what that sentence did." Hasnat Khan had told her he didn't think for 1 minute that she would say yes, but he asked her anyway. Charles had asked her in a nursery at Windsor Castle after meeting her 13 times, and told her the night before the wedding that he didn't love her. One man assumed she would say no. One man told her he didn't love her before she had even said yes. She said yes to both of them in different ways. But only one of those yeses, she said, came from the place she was trying to reach her whole life. The genuine place. The place that had no institution around it, and no press steps and no reporter asking the obvious question. With Khan it was 4.5 hours in a Greek restaurant, and nobody watching. With Charles it was a question about love, and a 4-word answer that she spent the rest of her life describing as trauma-teasing. The difference between those 2 stories is the whole story of Diana. There is one more thing the record holds about that day, a detail small enough to miss and significant enough that once you see it, you cannot look away. When the reporter asked the question and Charles gave his answer, Diana laughed. Not a real laugh. The specific laugh that comes when something has landed wrongly and the body reaches for the nearest available social gesture to cover the gap. She laughed and looked away, and the cameras read it as charming. As the natural response of a young woman slightly overwhelmed by the occasion. As one more piece of the fairy tale. Nobody read it as what it was, a 19-year-old girl in the half-second between hearing something that had just shifted something inside her and composing her face for the next camera angle, using the only tool she had available. She had been doing that her whole short life, using the laugh, using the smile, using the grace and the warmth and the particular Diana quality that the world would eventually call her superpower, the ability to be present for everyone around her regardless of what was happening inside. She had developed it, she would later say, as a survival mechanism, as the way you stay upright in rooms that are not designed to hold you. She used it on the steps of Buckingham Palace on February 24, 1981, the first day of the public life, the day the ring went on, the day the sentence landed. She laughed. She looked away, she held the smile. And somewhere underneath all of it, in the part of her that was already filing things in the vivid memory, she was storing the 4 words in the place where the true record lived, the place she would eventually open into a recorder in a private room when she was ready to say what she knew, leave her on the steps, not on the wedding day. On the engagement day, February 24, 1981, the moment just after the 4 words landed and before she composed her face for the cameras. She is 19 years old. She has said yes. The ring is on her finger. 750 million people are not yet watching. That comes later, but a great many are watching now, in smaller numbers, and they are reading her face for the joy that the moment is supposed to contain. She has just heard, whatever love means. She is thinking, what a strange answer. She is thinking, God. She has not yet found the word traumatized for it, because the word will come later, when she has had years to understand what the sentence was telling her. Right now, she just knows that something has gone wrong, that the answer was not the answer, that the yes she said and the answer he gave were not the same kind of sentence. The cameras are still going. She will smile in a moment. She will smile beautifully, the way she always did, the way that the world would learn to read as Diana being Diana. She will hold the ring up. She will stand beside him. She will perform the beginning of the fairy tale with complete precision. But in this half-second, before the smile, she is just a 19-year-old girl who has just been told that the man she is going to marry is not prepared to say he is in love with her, without first establishing that love is a concept whose meaning is unclear. She will spend 15 years inside the marriage that sentence predicted. She will describe it, on tape, in a private room, at the age of 31, as traumatizing. She will say, whatever love means, she will say, that threw me completely. She will say, God. She was right about all of it. From the steps. Before it began, 19 years old and already, in the half-second before the smile, understanding something that the institutions surrounding her would spend 15 years pretending wasn't there. The smile comes. The cameras get what they came for. But she knows. She already knows. She always knew. Thank you for staying with me through this one. Of all the moments in Diana's story, this is the one that sits at the very root of everything that followed. Not the confrontation in the basement, not the panorama interview, not the crash in Paris. This one. A reporter asking a simple question, a young woman saying of course, and a man turning to the camera and saying whatever love means. 4 words, said in public. On the day the fairy tale was supposed to begin, and Diana, standing there with the ring on her finger and the cameras in her face, hearing them land, carrying them for 16 years, never finding a place to put them down. The sentence that told her, before the wedding, before the honeymoon, before all of it, exactly what she was walking into. She walked in anyway, with everything she had. That is the thing about Diana, that never stops being true. She always brought everything she had, even when she already knew.